Welcome to day 14 of revision for UPSC 2027. In this video, I am going to revise the essay which was asked in 2025 mains. So let's get started. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. I already told in my earlier videos that because we are in a practice or I am in a practice, so you will see the introduction, these kind of headings, the flow diagram in this. But when you write actual essay, whether in mock or in real exam, you need not to give all these headings or the flow diagram. Okay, so start. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. More than 2.5 millennia ago, on the banks of the Yangtze River, a general named Sun Tzu sat in quiet contemplation, formulating a philosophy that would outlive the kingdoms of Wu, Shu, and Min. While contemporary strategists busied themselves designing sharper spears and denser phalanxes, Sun Tzu looked past the blood-soaked trenches to argue that physical combat represents a failure of strategy. He captured this insight in a timeless maxim: the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. This paradox suggests that the highest victory is not achieved by annihilating the adversary, but by rendering their resistance impossible through psychological, diplomatic, structural, and moral superiority. This philosophical lens changes how we think about conflict. It reframes war from a chaotic display of physical force into a calculated contest of minds. Physical warfare, even when successful, drains the state, destroys wealth, leaves deep generational trauma, and sows the seed of future revenge. In contrast, subduing an adversary without kinetic force preserves resources, maintains moral authority, and transforms the structural balance of power without the cost of open battle. This essay argues that the ultimate expression of strategic intelligence lies in avoiding kinetic conflict by using structural, ethical, diplomatic, economic, and psychological frameworks. True victory is not about winning a war, it is about out strategizing the need for war itself. The core philosophy moving beyond kinetic destruction. To understand Sun Tzu's insight, we must first look at the difference between short-term dominance and sustainable victory. Traditional warfare views power through a zero-sum lens where victory is measured by casualties, conquered lands, and physical destruction. However, history shows that this approach rarely brings lasting peace. When an enemy is subdued by force alone, their operational capacity may be broken, but their underlying hostility remains. The end of one conflict often lays the groundwork for the next, as seen in how the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles directly contributed to the rise of totalitarianism and the outbreak of the Second World War. Subduing an enemy without fighting offers a different path based on strategic prevention and structural conversation. Instead of attacking an adversary's armies, this approach targets their strategy, alliance, and will to fight. It focuses on changing the environment so thoroughly that the adversary realizes aggression would lead to their own destruction. This philosophy views power not as a destructive hammer, but as a subtle pervasive current. By shaping the context of interaction, a state can guide an opponent toward compliance without firing a single shot. This aligns closely with the ancient Indian concept of upayas. Upay, and this word is upay, but in English we write it like this: Upayas found in the Kautilya's Arthashastra, which prioritizes Sama, alliance building, and Dan, concessions over Dand, force, recognizing that open conflict should always be an administrator's last resort. Actually, Kautilya was of the opinion that it was not like you never use force or punishment, but he was of the opinion that you should not use punishment, but once you use it, you need to make sure that you need not to use it again. So, if you understand what I'm trying to say, so it is not like he was completely against the punishment. Historical foundations: the power of ideals and non-violence. History History offers many examples where major geopolitical and social changes occurred without open warfare. A primary example is in the Indian freedom movement led by Mahatma Gandhi. The British Empire possessed unmatched military power, sophisticated weaponry, and global logistics. Meeting this empire with kinetic force would have played directly into its strength. Instead, Gandhi used satyagraha, truth force, and ahimsa non-violence. By organizing boycotts, non-violent marches, and civil disobedience, he dismantled the moral justification for British rule. The empire found itself unable to use its military tool effectively against a population that refused to fight back using traditional means. The British were subdued not by physical weapons but by their own loss of moral authority. This demonstrates that an adversary can be neutralized by rendering their military tools useless through moral clarity. On a global scale, the Cold War offers another clear study of this dynamic. For over 40 years, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in an intense ideological struggle. Despite building massive nuclear arsenals, the core conflict was resolved without direct military engagement between the two superpowers. The Soviet Union dissolved not from a battlefield defeat, but due to internal economic strain, political structural issue, and the soft power appeal of open markets and personal freedoms. The West won the Cold War by outproducing, outbuilding, and outlasting its opponent, demonstrating that systemic strength can resolve global standoffs without open warfare. The modern geopolitical dimension, soft power, and deterrence. In our connected world, the tools used to subdue an adversary without fighting have evolved significantly. Harvard political scientist Joseph Nye defined this capacity as soft power, the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. Today, nations project influence globally through cultural reach, academic institutions, technological platforms, and democratic values. When a nation's culture and ideals become appealing to others, it reduces the likelihood of conflict by creating shared values and common perspective. Alongside soft power sits the strategy of credible deterrence. True deterrence operates on a psychological level. Sorry. True deterrence operates on a psychological level. A state builds its defensive capabilities so clearly that any potential attacker realizes the cost of aggression will far outweigh the benefits. India's nuclear doctrine, built around a credible minimum deterrence and a strict no first use policy, reflects this approach. The country's strategic capabilities are designed not to initiate war but to ensure that an adversary chooses negotiation or over conflict, maintaining regional stability through structural deterrence. International partnerships play an equally vital role in this framework. Alignments like quadrilateral security dialogue serve as structural checks against unilateral aggression in the Indo-Pacific. By focusing on maritime security, disaster relief, and infrastructure development, these partnerships stabilize the region without laying on formal military alliances, showing how collaborative diplomacy can ensure peace. The economic and technological frontiers, interdependence as a shield. In our globalized economy, financial and technological structures have become primary tools for managing international conflicts. Complex global supply chains have turned into a powerful mechanism for peace. When nations are deeply dependent on one another for technology, energy, and markets, the cost of open war becomes economically ruinous for all sides. This concept, known as complex interdependence, suggests that global economic integration acts as a natural check on military ambitions. A nation integrated into the global financial system risks immediate economic isolation if it initiates a conflict, making peaceful negotiation the far more logical choice. Simultaneously, the rise of digital technology has introduced new areas of competition. Algorithmic competition, artificial intelligence, and deep learning models shape global information landscapes, influencing public perception without physical deployment. Cyber resiliency. Strong cyber defenses protect critical national infrastructure like power grids and financial networks, preventing digital subversion from undermining national security. Information integrity. Protecting the public square from targeted misinformation campaigns preserves domestic unity, neutralizing an adversary's attempts to create internal divisions. Ethical and constitutional dimensions, the moral foundation of peace. The choice to avoid kinetic conflict is deeply rooted in ethical principles and constitutional mandates. From a deontological perspective, the state has a fundamental moral duty to protect human life and dignity because physical warfare causes unavoidable civilian suffering and destruction. Avoiding open combat is an ethical necessity for responsible leadership. This moral commitment is woven into the constitutional fabric of democratic nations. Article 51 of the Indian Constitution, enshrined within the directive principle of state policy, explicitly directs the state to promote international peace and security, maintain just and honorable relation between nations, foster respect for international law and treaty obligation, encourage the settlement of international disputes by arbitration. By prioritizing international law and peaceful dispute resolution, the Constitution provides a clear framework for managing external challenges through diplomacy rather than force. This ethical, this ethical stance ensures that the pursuit of security remains aligned with the core democratic values of justice and human rights. Administrative and individual application, resolving daily conflicts. The philosophy of subduing opposition without conflict extends far beyond international relations. It serves as a core principle for effective public administration and civil service. A skilled administrator does not rely on the coercive power of the state to enforce compliance. Using state power arbitrarily often creates public resentment, damages institutional trust, and leads to ongoing legal disputes. Instead, effective public servants use empathetic communication, transparency, and public engagement to resolve local challenges. For example, when managing complex land acquisition or public protest, an insightful administrator does not resort to police force. Instead, they bring stakeholders together, address underlying economic anxieties, and design collaborative solutions. By resolving tensions through dialogue, the administrator secures public cooperation without creating institutional friction, demonstrating Sun Tzu's principle at the grassroots level. On an individual level, this approach relies heavily on emotional intelligence. True personal maturity is the capacity to diffuse interpersonal hostility through active listening and emotional balance rather than escalating arguments. By managing internal impulses and understanding an opponent's motivation, An individual can transform a hostile situation into a constructive dialogue. This reflects the ancient wisdom of Thirukural. Those who in trouble, untroubled are, will trouble itself. This question was asked in the ethics in the same year. The question was this statement was given and you need to explain this. Sun Tzu's ancient wisdom remains highly relevant in our contemporary world. As modern challenges grow more complex, the limitation of power, the limitations of physical force become increasingly apparent. True victory cannot be found in destroyed cities or broken economies. It is achieved when the causes of conflicts are managed through foresight, ethical leadership, and structural strength. Subduing an enemy without fighting requires a comprehensive approach to national power. It demands that a nation build strong economic foundations, preserve social cohesion, maintain reliable defensive deterrence, and uphold its moral principles. This strategy shifts the focus of governance from preparing for unavoidable wars to actively building the structures that preserve long term peace. Ultimately, the highest achievement of strategy is to create a world where open conflict becomes unnecessary. By prioritizing diplomacy, shared economic progress, and human dignity, nations can move past the destructive cycle of history. True strength lies not in the capacity to destroy, but in the wisdom to preserve, cultivate, and unite. Although this was an ideological essay inclined towards idealism, but things do not work like this in the real world. Anyway, if you have anything like that, just go through the information, store it in your mind, because in the exam you have to write idealistic things. Anyway,